Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
It's recording now. Oh, okay. Don't worry, we'll edit. Okay. This one.
I was asked to introduce you.
Okay, look. Yeah.
So I'll just mention that you're part of the Interact team at
Perfect.
the moment. You're at DCU. Your titles, are you a lecturer?
It's called
Research fellow?
assistant professor.
Assistant professor.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want me to say?
No, that sounds good.
You'll be talking about some of your doctoral work you did in Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that myself, so.
Okay. This is a good turnout considering the weather.
Yeah, and it's not even term time, right? So.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just see if JC wants this. We should probably start. Is there a camera that I should use?
Yeah, because it just need the slide and the.
Okay, kia ora koutou, hello, and welcome to the DPM seminar series. My name is Jay Marlowe. I'm in the School of Counseling, Human Services, Social Work over on the Epsom campus. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pat Cadwell to present some of his work that he did on his doctoral thesis in Japan. Pat is at Dublin City University. He's an assistant professor there with a focus on translation studies. And was also a visiting scholar while he's doing his doctorate here about 2 years ago.
It's actually more than that. It's nearly 4.
4 years ago.
Yeah.
Time flies. And so Pat, along with Sharon and Federico, who are here as well, are part of an Interact group, which is funded through the Mary Curie RISE, which is a Research Innovation Staff Exchange Fund through the EU, that brings people together to sort of look at important research questions, and that one is in relation to crisis translation. So Pat might talk about that a bit further, but I'll let Pat say a little more about himself, but can you please just join me in welcoming Pat to the DPM series.
Thank you very much.
And just so you know that this is being recorded, is that right, JC?
Yes, it's being recorded and it's going to be on our YouTube channel, the DPM Seminar Series YouTube channel, in the coming days.
Okay, great. I'm glad there's no cameras. So, yes, I thought I'd start out by maybe telling you just very briefly what translation studies is. So this is the discipline that we work in. Essentially, translation studies is interested in the theory and the practice and the application of translation. So what we do is we look at the products of translation, we look at the processes behind it, and of course we're also really interested in the people who translate. Generally, more broadly speaking, we are very interested in language and culture, but we view language and culture kind of through the prism of translation. And obviously, we tend to look at language and culture in lots of different settings. And the setting that I'm particularly interested in and that we're interested in this project is the setting of a disaster. So that's kind of why we're here. And as Jay said, the project that we're working on, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, is essentially involved in crisis translation. This is the kind of the plan that I have for what I'll talk about today. I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about what research work is currently going on in our discipline in regards to disasters. And as Jay said, I'd like to use the case study that I did of the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake to kind of drill down a little bit deeper into the role of language and culture and translation when a disaster happens. I decided to pick out three kind of big ideas from my PhD. The first idea I thought I'd talk about is how language and culture can be seen as a layer of vulnerability, but also that it can be seen as a capacity from what I found in my case study. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the role that translators or translation might play in relationships, and especially in establishing or maybe not exactly facilitating relationships of trust. And then I'll also spend a good part giving you some detail about this research project called Interact, the International Network on Crisis Translation. But because I believe we have some geographers in the room, I thought I'd start with a map. I spent a lot of time yesterday hopefully putting the arrows in the right place, but I'm not 100% confident. But anyway, that's not the most important point. I wanted to use the map to show you that there is a kind of a small but growing number of people in our discipline that are interested in looking at disaster contexts. Not necessarily all looking at the same disasters, but some are looking more from a conflict perspective, others are looking more from, for example, earthquakes or tsunamis. What you can see here is that, for example, here we have a kind of a cluster of researchers who are interested in particular in earthquake-related disasters in Turkey. The kind of the perspective that they take is maybe training translators and interpreters in emergency response, so kind of expanding the role of the translator in some regard. And then maybe here and here you can see that some researchers, a lot of them based out of Geneva, are looking at various conflicts. So conflicts in maybe Syria or Iraq and Somalia, and in particular the influence that the migrations of people to refugee camps have in Jordan and Kenya from these conflicts. And their interest is looking at how training in translation and interpreting can be used as a kind of a resource of empowerment and education in these refugee camps. Then this context here of Japan is the one that I know most about. So obviously Japan is a disaster-prone country. And one of the things that this kind of cluster of researchers here are interested in is, in particular, the relationship between translation and ICT, so information and communication technologies, and also just in technology more broadly. So there are certain very specialized translation technologies that are available. For example, this automated translation like machine translation. You might be familiar with, Google Translate. Those kind of ideas are the sort of things that we're looking at. But this has also been looked at a lot in relation to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So they were also particularly interested in the role that technology played, and in particular how diaspora communities of Haitians outside of Haiti could be harnessed through technology and through various platforms to contribute in some ways to response and recovery. And you'll see here that I have New Zealand coming soon. This is essentially some of the work that we're doing while we're here. In translation studies, hello, not at all. We've decided to take a look at policy in particular. So disaster-related policy in terms of translation. Is it recognized? Is it not recognized? Should it be there? Should it not be there? And we're also interested in looking at training. So training of translators and interpreters using the context of New Zealand. So I mapped that geographically, but I could have also plotted it in time to tell a bit of a different story, because if I gave you a timeline, what you'd probably notice is that 2010 and 2011 were really pivotal years for this interest in crisis translation or disaster translation, because as you all remember, in 2010 and 2011 there were several large-scale, highly mediatized disasters in quick succession. And what was interesting from a translation studies perspective was that language in particular, not just language and culture, but language was really foregrounded in the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, in the 2010 and 2011 Canterbury earthquakes, and then in the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. So often when we see translation or language or culture talked about in disaster-related literature, it's that kind of culture and language are lumped together. And from a translation studies perspective, that's not perhaps telling you the most valuable information. So what was interesting about the 2010 and 2011 period was that, to a certain extent, language and culture were explored a bit more systematically. And certainly a lot of the work, a lot of the motivation, I guess, for crisis translation came out of that period. So in Haiti, for example, the big language issue was that the majority of the responders who were responding to the disaster didn't speak Haitian Creole or French, which were the official languages of that setting. And so, as I said, technology was used to kind of harness these diaspora communities outside of Haiti to work to kind of gather the Haitians' voices on the ground through technology, translate it into modes and into formats that the responders could use. So that was kind of the big language issue there. And a lot of work was done, for example, on developing technologies for Haitian Creole. As a language of very limited diffusion, there wasn't really very much, if anything at all. So through that context, lots of new technologies for this minority language were developed. Then in the Canterbury earthquakes in 2010 and 2011, obviously in Christchurch, you're well aware that almost half of the people who lost their lives were not New Zealand nationals. And the kind of language issue that appeared from that context was that there weren't really enough linguistic resources to support the families of the people who lost their lives. So many Japanese people lost their lives in Christchurch, and there weren't enough qualified interpreters or people with Japanese language skills to support the families in dealing with the very practical issues, but also the emotional issues of losing loved ones in a different country. And then in Japan, the language issues, I know this context quite well, so I would say there's quite a lot, but the one that really stood out was the complexity of the language and the communication. If you remember, Japan wasn't just an earthquake, it was this tsunami that led to the nuclear disaster. So it was a highly complex disaster. And for that reason, there was, it was a disaster because of the nuclear aspect that crossed borders. So there was a lot of highly technical, highly complex communication going on across borders in that disaster. And again, that really foregrounded language, but also language and culture and translation in that setting. So another kind of way of looking at what's being done in translation studies, instead of looking at it geographically or looking at it over time, is just to talk about what some of the big themes are in the research that's being done at the moment. Obviously, the big one is to look at language and culture as a barrier. So seeing it very much in terms of vulnerability and need, and I don't deny that that's absolutely necessary, and work needs to be done on overcoming these walls and these barriers. But what we would also argue in translation studies is that there are a lot of other interesting questions that need to be answered and that we feel we have some knowledge about that could help in disaster prevention and management. So we would know quite a lot about the profiles and roles of translators and interpreters and how this can be applied to disaster settings. One of the big issues we have is the very kind of problematic classification between volunteer and professional. So we do a lot of work in our discipline thinking about what makes a volunteer, what makes a professional, and in a disaster setting, sometimes that's maybe magnified or sometimes that's confused. So we're definitely interested in looking at that kind of issue of classifying people and supporting their needs. More generally, in terms of support, we're also interested in looking at training people. So one of the things that we're looking at in our project is the idea of the citizen translator. So taking somebody with certain linguistic skills, so they might speak 2 or 3 or 4 languages, but they might not be used to translating or interpreting. And there are certain skills that we know about that will help people who have multiple languages do a better job in a translation setting. So we're looking at kind of the needs and the practices, but we're also looking at the role that technology could play. Now, we're all aware of the issues involved in technology in disasters because of connectivity, power, and all of that. But with certain mobile devices and battery-powered devices, and a lot of the work that's being done on mobile networks, we think there is a space for at least considering the role of technology. Then we have a mountain of ethical issues. When you look at translation and interpreting, just in a standard context, there are ethical issues. And there are certain kind of, I suppose, ethical pillars that are always involved in a relationship of translation or interpreting. And we've been talking about them over the past few weeks while we've been here. You know, there are things like accuracy, confidentiality, neutrality, impartiality, agency. These are all things that we talk about in standard translation and interpreting contexts. But then when you transport that into a disaster setting, do those ethical issues still apply? Are they magnified? Should they be in some ways rethought? We have a lot of work to do in this area, but we would also argue that we have some knowledge from our own discipline that we could maybe bring to disaster prevention and management. And then the last thing, as I said, is something that we're kind of working on at the moment while we're here in New Zealand. It's the recognition or the non-recognition of translation in disaster-related policy. You'll notice that I haven't put anything about implementation there yet because we haven't gotten to that stage. We're just at the moment looking at policies to see if translation or interpreting is actually in there at all, and kind of asking the question whether it should be or it shouldn't be, and what difference it might make if it is recognized. At the moment, the picture seems to be one of non-recognition, but that does, to a certain extent, depend on the context that you're looking at. And you know, based on my own experience of doing the PhD in Japan back 4 or 5 years ago, there's been a big shift. And in terms of the Japanese policy now, there is much greater recognition of translators, interpreters, and especially the role of volunteers in the policy. Whether that's implemented or not is a question for a little later. So those are kind of the big issues that we're looking at as a discipline. After that kind of like high-level view, I thought I'd use the case that I know the best to maybe go a little bit deeper and discuss some of the roles of diversity in terms of language and culture. So to give you a bit of personal background first, I was working in Japan in 2011 when the disaster hit. I had been living in Japan for about almost 9 years at that stage. So I could speak Japanese and I was pretty comfortable, you know, living and working in a Japanese environment. The company that I worked in the head office in Tokyo, but the company had factories, we had research centers, and we had sales offices all through the disaster-affected region. So just personally, in terms of my life experience, it was a big event. And in terms of the company that I worked for, it was a huge event. So because I could speak some Japanese and I kind of was comfortable in the Japanese culture, I became interested in whether or not other foreign residents had similar experiences or different experiences. So I started asking questions like kind of, well, I knew how I communicated, or I knew what role kind of translating or interpreting played for me, but what about other people who were not Japanese who were there at the time? And that's where the idea for my PhD came about. And I had 3 fairly basic research questions. I wanted to know how foreign nationals communicated, how they gathered information. So I wanted to know if translation and interpreting formed any part of that communication. And then the third question was really kind of the so what. Like I wanted to show, was there any value to considering translation and interpreting from the perspective of foreign people living in the disaster. So, like I said a bit earlier at the beginning, it was a big, complex disaster. You'll probably remember that it was this massive magnitude 9 earthquake that started everything. It hit in this northeastern Tohoku region of Japan. And what happened was this massive earthquake created the tsunami that then led on to the nuclear disaster. So the worst affected areas were definitely kind of 3 or 4 prefectures here in this part of the Tohoku region near where the earthquake hit. But the actual official disaster zone stretched all the way from here down to Tokyo. So there was a very, very large disaster-affected area, and that's why there were there were more than 670,000 foreign residents. So those are foreign nationals who were recorded as living in the area. Of course, there may have been other non-residents, so business travelers or tourists. There could also be refugees. There could be a lot of other groups that we don't know about, but these were the people who were on the official records. More than 18,000 people lost their lives, and 92% of those fatalities were through drowning. So by far, the tsunami was the most deadly of the 3 disasters, but the nuclear disaster is still ongoing, and it will be for years to come. More than 6,000 people were injured, and of the people who lost their lives, 41 were recorded as being from another nationality than Japanese, mostly Chinese and Korean. The big impact for foreign nationals was that the month after the disaster hit, there were 40,000 fewer foreign nationals living in Japan. So I just wanted to put that context up there to make you think about the complexity of the disaster and the fact that it had a huge impact on rural and fishing communities of Japanese nationals, but that there were also some non-Japanese, some foreign nationals who were affected quite deeply. Like I said, I could have in the case study looked at business travelers or tourists or international responders. For very pragmatic reasons, I chose foreign residents, so people who were living there, because first of all, I had that kind of experience myself, but also just practically, compared to business travelers or tourists, it was easier to gain access to them to participate in my research. And the same kind of goes for the international responders. So I won't spend too long talking about the methodology because it was a case study. So I went back to Japan and I had face-to-face individual interviews with 28 people. So these were 28 foreigners who were living in the disaster-affected zone at the time of the disaster. They came from 12 different nationalities, so pretty much all over the world. I was lucky enough to be able to talk to people from a wide variety of perspectives, so a lot of different ages, occupations. Some had been in Japan only a month when the disaster hit. Others had been there for more than 20 years. And similarly, the level of Japanese language ability of these people also varied from absolute beginner to interpreter, professional interpreter. what I did was I combined these interview data with official reports and surveys, lots of other grey literature, and I built a corpus of disaster, a very small illustrative corpus of disaster communication. And then I tried to kind of pick a fairly methodologically robust way of tying that all together through various phases of thematic analysis. So what I tried to do today is to think about, from all these data that I have, what might a room of people who come to a disaster prevention and management seminar want to hear about. So I thought that maybe picking these 3 issues might be interesting. So what I can talk a little bit about is how language and culture did represent vulnerability for some of the foreign residents that I spoke to. But I do think you can also tell a story of capacity. And the aspect that I became personally quite interested in was the role that language and culture might have and that translation might play in terms of building trusting relationships in a disaster setting. So in terms of vulnerability, I just put this slide up here. You don't need to read everything. It's more just to show you that, for sure, there were a lot of needs that foreign residents expressed. There were a lot of situations and a lot of settings in which, without translation or interpreting, they wouldn't have understood what was going on. So I suppose just to show you that there are there's a lot of variety in there, but it also stretches across the disaster in terms of time. So there is a tendency to think in the literature at the moment that if you translate emergency warnings, that's done. You don't need to worry about foreign nationals in terms of vulnerability. And of course that's important, but based on the people that I spoke to, some of the greatest needs for translation came later on, once things got more complex. Because some of the foreigners who spoke no Japanese said that in terms of the earliest part of the disaster, they could copy other people, or they could use sort of some sign language, or they could just essentially kind of read the room and follow what others were doing. So in terms of those initial minutes or seconds, I'm not sure that translation or interpreting would have had as important an impact as later on when things got more complex. People were quite familiar, who'd been living there a while, were quite familiar with earthquakes. So in Japan, you have earthquakes all the time, so that wasn't really that complex for them because there was an element of familiarity. But tsunamis are less common. So once the tsunami hit, the context kind of changed, and that layer of vulnerability was maybe exposed that hadn't been there previously. And similarly, when the nuclear disaster hit, even those people who felt pretty confident in terms of language and culture with regards to an earthquake or a tsunami, suddenly they were outside their comfort zone too, because it was talking about very complex radioactive materials and so on. So I suppose what I wanted to do by showing you this is that I would hate for people to go away today thinking that my argument is foreigners are vulnerable in a disaster in terms of language and culture. They are, but I would argue that it's highly contextual. And the things that seem to kind of trigger vulnerability or kind of unpeel that layer of vulnerability were things like the phase of the disaster and the complexity of the information that was involved. So these people, like I said, who were working as professional interpreters and had lived in Japan for 20 years, they absolutely would not have considered themselves vulnerable at the start. But perhaps after a month or so, when the radioactive disaster was really getting very, very complicated, even they may have considered themselves more vulnerable. So I suppose my argument would just be, think of the contextuality and the layers of vulnerability for foreign nationals. And maybe in terms of our research agenda, I think it would be a mistake to focus everything, all our efforts at one phase. We need to maybe look at the contribution that translation or interpreting could make at various points. And especially maybe when things get into the sort of recovery period, I think translation or interpreting can make a big impact there. And perhaps also in terms of reduction and readiness. I could see translation in particular making some sort of contribution there. And perhaps it's in the response stage that interpreting could really help. But we've been talking about this, and it's very difficult to differentiate clearly the difference between the kind of the written word and the spoken word in terms of translation and interpreting in a disaster. It gets a lot fuzzier. So, like I said, there was also a story of kind of capacity in terms of the case study that I did. The people that I spoke to, they contributed, and they wanted to contribute to the response to the disaster. Not all of them were able to contribute a lot, but there was a desire there. So one of the things that was kind of clear to me was that there were essentially two big groups of people. There were these kind of friends, acquaintances, colleagues on the ground helping each other. So typically the pattern was that the more established foreign residents were helping those who were less established. So the people who had been there a bit longer were a real resource for the people who hadn't been there so long and were maybe more vulnerable. But also what was interesting was the foreign nationals were also helping their Japanese networks, especially in terms of the nuclear disaster, because there was certain information that was being released outside of Japan that wasn't being released inside of Japan, and they were mediating that information for their Japanese friends, acquaintances, colleagues. The other thing that was interesting about Japan was they really started to try to use local government as a kind of a coordinating post for these volunteer efforts. Because the disaster was long running, they had time to kind of work on this, and at the early stages there were only a few little pockets where the local governments were able to kind of coordinate and kind of harness this volunteer contribution from foreign residents. But in certain areas it became quite developed, and so local government also played a pretty important role. And one of the things, as I said, that I've noticed since the PhD is that some of those initial kind of models that were developed in 2011 are being kind of copied in other localities in different parts of Japan now, in terms of what's on the policy, the written policy. The other thing I wanted to talk about here was the term that we're really struggling with, community. We've been talking a lot about community since we've been here in New Zealand these last few weeks. From my case study, what was interesting to me was that the people I spoke to didn't talk about community along national or ethnic lines. They talked about community in terms of, following the disaster, bonds between me and the Japanese people around me, or me and other foreigners, grew. So in terms of the case study that I did, which is very small and not generalizable data, what I was interested in was community came to be defined more geographically and based on the people who were kind of going through things with you. So there was this kind of discourse of community, but there was a kind of a temporary nature to it. And there was also a bit of a discourse of disappointment, that after the worst of the disaster had passed, this kind of bond that people who perhaps had not been, so integrated prior to the disaster suddenly started to feel more integrated and more of a community dynamic with the people around them. It started to then fade once they moved kind of into the recovery phase. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I'm aware that community is a problematic concept, especially in terms of disaster prevention and management, but just based on what I found, I think there's something to be talked about in terms of thinking in community locally, as well as, so build capacity along maybe national or ethnic lines, but also don't forget that the people who are going to help you first are the neighbors and the people, colleagues and people around you. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about capacity. Yeah, this is the other kind of big finding that I had in my PhD. I set out asking people about translation and interpreting. I wanted to know, how did you communicate? Did translation or interpreting have any impact on your communication? What was interesting to me was they came back talking about trust. So even though I was asking them about translation and interpreting, they were answering about trust. So it made me consider whether there might be some relationship for foreign nationals between trust and translation. What I did in terms of the actual analysis was, rather than focusing on what trust is, because that's very problematic and nobody in the literature seems to agree on it, it's one of those things where it's kind of all around us and really important, but people don't agree on how to define it. In the work that I did, I tried to take a look at, well, what did it do? What did trust do in this particular setting for this particular group of people that I had? And what I found is that trust was something where it reduced people's uncertainty. It helped people to cooperate. It allowed people to act with more confidence. So it kind of spurred them towards action. It was a way that they could have their sort of perception of the crisis positively influenced. So if good news came from a trusted source, they felt better about the situation. And this is the one that I was really interested in. It kind of helped people select from a vast array of information. So if they had a lot of information in front of them, they'd ask, well, who is the source of that information? If I trust that source, that's the one I'll go with. That's the piece of information that I'll use. So what I did then in terms of the analysis was I just tried to use a kind of a particular theory of trust to go through all of these interview and case study data to see were there situations where translation or interpreting seemed to have contributed to one of those kind of functions of trust. And again, very small data, not much that you can generalize from it, but just in this particular case study, what I noticed was that the majority of the kind of the effect seemed to be around this idea of using trust to select the source of the information that you're going to use. So
sorry, did you want us to wait till the end to ask questions?
No, if you have something, go ahead now.
Just how did we end up in trust? Where there was a gap. Like, why trust? Is that the main finding from the whole process?
Yes. I mean, there is a lot of that I could have talked about in terms of translation or interpreting, but for me, the big finding was that when you asked people about their experience of communication through the lens of language and culture, they came back with this idea of trust. So there are other findings, but to me this was a particularly interesting one because it wasn't expected. And it wasn't something that I brought to the research. It was something that came from the participants.
Will you be telling us about other findings, or will you concentrate on trust?
I thought today, because of limited time, I'd focus just on basically on this big idea. I'd be happy afterwards to talk about some other findings if you're interested, and I have put a bibliography at the end on the slides. So I think if this is being recorded, you'll have all of the sources to look at as well, if that's okay. So because I thought it was about this idea of the selection of sources, that obviously made me think of relationships. And I have to give a major hat tip to Jay Marlowe here, because he said the other day that maybe the missing R in the 4 R's is relationships. So it might be that in terms of translation or translators, one of the, let's say, roles or contributions that translators could play with people who are interested in disaster prevention and management is establishing trusted relationships. So what I guess I'm saying is that one of the things I'd like to think about in terms of kind of overlap between, let's say, the Interact project and research that's being done in disaster prevention and management is maybe could we talk about how to better use translators or interpreters, or how to figure out what they need, what they don't need, how you can work better in terms of prevention and management with people who are acting as translators, how to judge maybe an effective translation from a less effective one, that kind of thing. It's just something that's kind of bubbling away in my mind at the moment. So that kind of leads me on to the second reason that I'm presenting here today. It's to talk about this project that we're working on here at the moment. So basically, to sum up, I suppose, my case study in a few words, yes, there is vulnerability and there are a lot of challenges involved in communicating in a disaster when people speak different languages or come from different cultures. But you can also flip that and also look at there is maybe room for capacity building in terms of using translation or interpreting as a way to build the resources of foreign communities, but also to help the local communities. And so it's in terms of these challenges and these opportunities that my colleague here, Sharon O'Brien, set up this research network. So it's called Interact, and it's the International Network on Crisis Translation. And as Jay mentioned at the start, it's funded by the European Union under their Horizon 2020 Marie Curie funding mechanism. And as Jay also pointed out, it's called a RISE network, which is Research and Innovation Staff Exchange. And the staff exchange is kind of the important bit here, because it tells you how the funding works. So essentially, the European Union gives money to this network to send people to work with each other in different locations. The idea is that you send people on secondments to different geographic locations, into different sectors, and across disciplines within academia. The funding that we have been given is for 3 years, and it started in April of this year, so things are still at the kind of the early stages, but even at this kind of early stage, we've started to gain some momentum. One of the big things for the RISE networks is that it should be across national borders. So you can see here that the consortium is made up on the academic side of Dublin City University, which is in Ireland, and UCL, which is in the UK, here in Auckland, and then we also have Arizona State University in the United States as an academic partner. What you can also see by looking here at the consortium is that within these partners, it's not just a translation studies network. The idea of the RISE scheme is that it should be, as I said, across disciplines. So in DCU, we have our language and translation here, but also computing and nursing. And then in Auckland, obviously, we have Jay in counselling, human services, and social work. We also have Minako O'Hagan in cultures, languages, and linguistics. And then at Arizona State, we have 3 partners across these various sort of public affairs and communication schools. Again, the idea of the RISE network is that it shouldn't be restricted. So it's not restricted only to academia. And the other idea is that it goes across sectors, like I said. So we have two other sectors involved in addition to academia in the network. This would be the NPO sector here with Translators Without Borders and Cochrane. And then we have the, let's say, technology sector with Unbabel and Microsoft Research. So Translators Without Borders, you may or may not have heard of. They kind of use the Médecins Sans Frontières model. And their idea is to kind of be the, I suppose, the coordination point between translators and NGOs. So kind of putting qualified translators in touch with NGOs to satisfy the communication needs. Then Cochrane is produces systematic reviews of health-related content for medical professionals, but they also simplify them then to give to the general public. And then Unbabel is a kind of artificial intelligence language company. They also are specialized in crowdsourcing and these platforms to bring large groups of people together to work on a task. And then, I guess, Microsoft Research, everyone would know. So one of the big issues in a network like this, where you're bringing people from different sectors, different disciplines, different geographic locations, is the idea that scope can end up being pretty wide. And then, of course, when you're looking at disasters, you have this kind of terminological issue of, well, what's the difference between a crisis and a disaster and emergency, and should we be kind of restricting ourselves to one or the other? So in a way, when Sharon was kind of thinking about how to structure the program, at first went very broad. So taking kind of as many possible scenarios as we could by using a sort of the term crisis as an event that is expected to lead to a dangerous situation, whether it is an emergency or a disaster. So set the net very wide at first, but then the idea was, well, focus in that broad array of settings on kind of health content, so health-related issues, and also focus on the written word rather than the spoken word. So this is what's being proposed in the project, and I think already we're recognizing that while that will be a priority for us, there will also be times where we kind of, it's a bit fuzzier and we're looking at different settings, and dividing written word and spoken word may be not that useful. Essentially, like with any research network, the purpose is to contribute to knowledge, of course. But also, one of the things that's proposed is to contribute to policy in this area of crisis translation, to develop expertise and skills, to develop training and training tools, and to examine the role of technology in crisis translation. So those are kind of the big aims. As I said, in relation to health-related information before and during a crisis. There is also this idea that by bringing people together across the world in different disciplines with different backgrounds, that you're kind of enhancing everyone's skills. And actually the reason that they have this sort of staff exchange model is because there is an obligation that it develops each individual's basic set of skills, and to some extent enhances the career development of those individuals. And then obviously we're looking at, yes, before and during a crisis, but we recognize that we do also need to be looking at the other R's, so thinking about reduction and thinking about readiness. So in terms of the big objectives, that's what we're hoping to do in the next 3 years. It has just started, so in terms of achieving those objectives, I think there's going to be, some room for maneuver. But what I can promise you is that whatever we do end up talking about, we will be talking about translation. And we'll be doing that with these perspectives from lots and lots of different areas, which I think is really interesting. So we'll be getting rich variety of viewpoints on this kind of phenomenon or concept that we're very interested in, from social sciences, from computer sciences, from humanities. And we'll also then be bringing in these non-academic partners, in particular with this kind of slant towards maybe technology and its contribution to the non-governmental sector. And the other thing which I think we have an obligation to do is to disseminate the results of our research widely, and not only in the sort of the traditional academic venues or the traditional academic ways. So we'll be trying to, again, this is still work in progress, but we'll be trying to use social media, use kind of town hall style meetings or workshops, and other ways of getting the knowledge that we produce in this network out there. I think I'm nearly there. Ah, yes, I did want to say this. So again, Sharon did a massive amount of work trying to structure the project and figure out a way of, structuring the tasks so that we would have a better chance of achieving these, very big objectives that have been set in the project. And to do this, she came up with a series of work packages. And the reason I put them up here is because I think in kind of quite an impactful way, it shows you what we're interested in this project. So by looking just at work package 2, you can see we're interested in policy, and we're going to do our best to make some sort of impact on policy in terms of disaster settings. We're also interested in looking at whether translation or interpreting is always the best solution. It could be that rather than mediating or changing the language, that just simplifying the source language, simplifying, you know, for example, in my case, Japanese, might be a more effective way to help people. So we are aware that this wonderful thing called translation that we love may not always be the best solution. So we're looking into simplifying source languages in a disaster setting, especially in this health content area. Colleagues are going to be looking at crisis machine translation. So I mentioned that automated translation, like, for example, Google Translate. And that's some expertise that Microsoft or, for example, the various academic partners can bring. And yeah, a kind of a model for that would have been, like I said, the Haiti earthquake, where in a very short space of time, they developed an automated translation system for Haitian Creole. So we're going to be looking at that kind of question. Another big aspect is training citizen translators. So this comes back to that idea that I mentioned about classifying people between volunteer and professional and how kind of fuzzy and complicated that is. Well, we've taken this concept of, you know, citizen scientist or citizen journalist and maybe transferred it to a translation setting. So we're going to be looking at maybe speedy ways to give people who have some linguistic ability the sort of knowledge they need to do a better job of translating or interpreting. So it's not starting from zero teaching somebody a language. It's teaching somebody who already has linguistic ability how they can do better in a short space of time at translating or interpreting. Like I said, ethics, we have a huge number of ethical issues across the board. One of the members of our network is an ethicist, and he's kind of our ethical advisor. And ethics actually really feeds into all of the work packages. So we're aware that all of these decisions that we make in a disaster setting have ethical impacts. So we're trying our best to keep the ethical focus fairly strong in the project. I think that's nearly all I wanted to say. Yes, I did put up this bibliography, which you're more than welcome to have a look at. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Patrick. That was great in terms of talking about translation as it relates to vulnerability, capacities, and trust. Also, for saying the context within a number of global events that have occurred, and we're talking about the Interact project. You helped me to understand it.
Okay.
Well. And so, really, I mean, this is a chance for anyone to respond to Pat's presentation. If there's any questions that they might want to have.
No, well, one thing that I can say is that particular solution that they came up with in the Haitian disaster is one way of looking at a kind of an automated solution. So we're going to be examining kind of if that's the way to go as a future model. In particular, at our university, at Dublin City University, we have some people who are really world-renowned experts in machine translation. So they're currently in Lisbon working with the partner on Babel on how to come up with maybe some solutions that might be more effective, but based, yeah, to a certain extent on what happened in Haiti.
I've heard that there's an app, either Dublin University or your university, that is for disaster management. It's just an app on your computer that you can just translate keywords that help with disaster management.
That's certainly one of the things that you'll notice is that underlying many of these like app or software solutions is this kind of idea of quick changing or transfer into a different language. And the technology that underlies that is machine translation. So these apps are based on the kind of the technologies. I'm not sure that actual app, though, is developed by our university. It could be that the technology behind it is. But the application of that, if you have a certain amount of technical knowledge, you can take these systems and apply them to lots of different types of software. But one of the things we need to look at is whether, for example, in terms of the ethics that I talked about, is a solution like that the correct solution? Because remember I said we have some kind of standard pillars of like accuracy or confidentiality or impartiality. So, for example, in terms of accuracy, we'd want to know whether when you actually press that button into another language, is the result that you're getting accurate? Or would it actually be telling you something that might not be that useful or that might be incorrect? Similarly then, in terms of confidentiality, the whole machine translation area, you need to get lots and lots of digital resources. So you need to have lots of digitized texts in order to be able to create these quick solutions where you just press a button. There's a lot of ethical questions about that data. How do you get it? How do you make sure that you're allowed to use it? How do you protect the identities of the people who created that data? So the machine translation solutions that we're going to be looking at are, of course, technical and technological solutions, but we can't separate them from the other issues like the ethics issues or the kind of difference between, is a machine better than a human in this particular setting?
First of all, just thanks. That was really interesting. I was curious from your Japan case study, sort of the low trust areas, and were there any sort of narratives of miscommunication because of translation, or was it just lack of communication?
Oh, absolutely. One of the big findings was a lack of just sufficient resources, but also there were huge issues of miscommunication. In fact, kind of linked to the previous questioner's statement, that some people did try to deploy technical solutions like a machine translation engine for very complicated data. So something to do with, let's say, the nuclear disaster. Even for humans, it's incredibly complex and very difficult